Decided to talk about homophobia in the Black community for our long-form proposal project. Um, I should have started with this, but I'm Alana Thomas, and
I'm Janae Cotton.
so choosing our topic, we started talking about some of the intersecting issues we talked about in class, and sexuality and race are the ones that resonated with us most. I was talking to Janae about how in another course we talked about homophobia and Christianity and how it differs between Black and white churches. The specific example that my professor discussed was differences between the AME church and the Methodist church, which are essentially the same, except the AME church is Black and the Methodist church is white. Everything about their theology is the same. Except for recently, the Methodist church has splitted because half of the organization or half of the church would like to accept LGBTQ plus marriages and would like to have ministers be able to ordain LGBTQ plus marriages. And the AME church has not even begun discussing this issue because it's still largely frowned upon within the Black community and within the AME church community. And that was particularly interesting to me because we spoke about how both the AME Church and the Methodist Church are two of the most progressive churches and really have a hand in activism. Like a lot of AME and Methodist chapters attended Black Lives Matter protests and things like that. So it was interesting to see how within the Black and white communities, there were differences on homosexuality and gay marriage. So since that resonated with us, we decided to take a deeper look at homophobia within the Black community and, why that may be. Like, why are we still so uncomfortable with moving forward in terms of homosexual issues?
So expanding on what Alana mentioned about the church and the African American community within the church, the church for African Americans is usually seen as the place in which we draw strength, but for homosexuals, it can also be seen as a place of condemnation. And so with young gay youth, it can cause a lot of friction within their sexual identity and religious identity. So that can make it harder for them to feel comfortable during this transitional period or to feel comfortable coming out to their family and friends, and with fear of homophobia or isolation. And so a lot of the times the support that is needed isn't received just because of this fear. And then while doing our project, we found some statistics to take a look at about homophobia within the Black community. So the first thing we found was 77% of LGBTQ youth say they have heard family members say negative things about LGBTQ people. Only 19% of LGBTQ youth say they can definitely be themselves at home. 47% of Black youth have been teased or mocked by family for being LGBTQ, and only 26% of Black LGBTQ youth have had their families get involved in their community. And while looking at these stats, researching, I noticed that this is something that I have seen, and I guess I was, you could say, blind to it before really diving into this project, because I wasn't aware of how much homophobia we do face in the Black community. But realizing that I've seen this firsthand, especially the statistic about only 19% of Black LGBTQ youth say they can definitely be themselves at home, which is just a big deal, because when doing this project, we talked to people, and I talked to someone who only a portion of his family knows or is aware of it, and the portion that does know is the portion that he felt he would receive the most support from. So when other family does come around, it's kind of hush hush about that he is homosexual. And I just think that's a big thing to realize when taking on a project such as this, and how that can really affect also the mental health of someone going through a transition like this.
To talk about some of the journals that we read and researched throughout the process of making this proposal. Homophobia, Masculinity in the U.S. Black Church is an article by Elijah G. Ward that sort of talks about the relationship between homophobia in the Black community and the Black Church. I noticed that it pointed at religious beliefs, historical sexual exploitation, and race survival consciousness as the primary sources of homophobia within the Black community. And I also like the way that it mentions colonialism and how colonialism influenced the Black community's relationships with not only the church, but with hypermasculinity and homophobia. Another journal article that we looked at is called Black and White Differences in Attitudes Towards Homosexuality and Gay Rights. And this article is by Gregory B. Lewis. The study observes the differences between how Black and white communities feel about LGBTQ plus issues. And there was a survey taken in this particular study that found Black people were 11 to 14% more likely to say that homosexuality is always wrong and that HIV and AIDS might be God's punishment for immoral sexual behavior. So this is sort of linking back to how Black people's relationship to the church influences their ideas about homosexuality and the gay community, which I found particularly interesting while doing research.
To continue with the literature review, I found an article titled Growing Up Gay in Black America, an exploration of the coming out process of queer African American youth. So this article's main focus was on the experience of coming out as an African American, but more specifically, the impact it has on relationships with family members and friends. And it also dives into how childhood experiences of homophobia and heterosexism in the African American community and household influenced beliefs about sexual orientation, which also kind of ties in, just going back to the African American community within the church, which is also mentioned in this article, and just how the ideas and preconceived notions start pretty early on. And another article I found was similarities and differences in homophobia among African Americans versus Caucasians. And so this article was explaining a study that was conducted to observe the similarities and differences among African Americans and Caucasians, but more so regarding the negative and positive emotions expressed towards homophobia. And so the results concluded that African Americans express greater negativity towards homosexuals, and that African American males express more negativity towards gay males compared to lesbians. And while African Americans and Caucasians did have some similarities, the negative emotions expressed by African Americans unfortunately did outweigh the emotions expressed by Caucasians. And I thought it was interesting to see that African American males express more negativity towards gay males when compared to lesbians, which I feel like is more so seen, like we do see that it's not as accepted when a gay man comes out versus when it's a girl that comes out.
That actually ties back to one of the articles that I mentioned as well, the one that was talking about hypermasculinity, homophobia, and the Black church. Hypermasculinity, I think, has something to do with why African American males express more negativity towards gay males compared to lesbians. Because when I was doing the reading, there was a part that spoke about how Black males in the community were looking at the hypermasculine Black male as the ultimate way to combat the oppressive forces of white men. So to be like the ultimate man, you have to be able to overpower and overcome white masculinity, which I think is why we move towards hypermasculinity so often within our own community. So it's interesting that the study picked up on that.
Yeah.
To talk a bit about methodology, researching the issue initially, a lot of it was just online, sort of looking at statistics to back up this hypothesis based on what I talked about in the beginning with the AME Church and Methodist Church. And then we were looking to localize the issue by talking to people within our community. So we contacted some Black LGBTQ plus organizations in our area to talk about how our story is relevant to their community. So two of the ones that we reached out to were the National Black Pride organization that attends Pride events in the summer and throughout the year. And then another one that we spoke to is called Ignite, which is a Black LGBTQ plus social group that does things like bowling nights, and they'll go out to dinner sometimes, things like that. We also spoke to some Black LGBTQ plus MTSU students, as well as other Middle Tennessee residents, about their personal experiences with racism within their own communities and families, which actually leads us to Kennedy, which is a woman we spoke to. She is an agriculture student at Tennessee State University, and she's also a member of the LGBTQ plus community. During our shoot, she spoke with us about how her father being a pastor at a Black church made it challenging for her to come out to her family as a bisexual woman. She said, in a quote, "Being so involved with my church made it hard for me to come to terms with my sexuality. It never even felt like an option to exist outside of the boundaries my church and family agreed with." We thought for the media portion, it would be a really great idea to do photographs of people so that it provides a name and face to some of the people who are afflicted with the issues we're talking about in our proposal. There are so many people with Kennedy's story, whether their father's a pastor or not, because Black people do have a real connection to their church, and it offers a sense of community that we don't often get, especially in a predominantly white society. So a lot of people go to Black churches seeking refuge and seeking a place of familiarity because there are so many people that look like you and have your shared experience, but you can begin to feel really ostracized and othered in this community when you're a part of the LGBTQ plus community as well. So talking about those challenges with her were really interesting. And we think that having more photos like this would be a good idea to add to a finished story. So we think that this story is important and has a lot of value because it centers real people within our community who are often misrepresented and unheard. So a lot of people who have a similar experience to Kennedy would be the people who are focused on in this particular story. I also think it would help eliminate some of the stigmas toward homosexuality in the Black community, which would help propel us forward with these issues so that maybe we would not feel or be really so behind in how we view homosexuality. It also provides historical context for why homophobia is rampant in the Black community, because I don't want to demonize the Black community and make people think that we are just a bunch of homophobic people for no reason. The historical context really matters in this particular issue because a lot of it stems from the trauma and pain that we experienced during slavery. And I think focusing on that for at least a part of the story that we do would be really beneficial in helping people understand. And we also think it opens the floor for more conversation on relative topics, which Janae will talk a bit about.
So some more topics or possible story angles that could be taken include how homophobia influenced lagging efforts in HIV/AIDS care and prevention measures, specifically within communities of color. And I think this was something that was really prevalent, especially first when the LGBTQ community became more widespread, that was seen a lot more. And also a look into how anti-LGBTQ legislation impacts LGBTQ communities of color.
This is just our bibliography with all of our sources that we use to conduct our research for this proposal. Thank you so much for listening.